I would argue that as of now, one of the biggest geopolitical losers as a result of the nuclear deal has been Saudi Arabia. For the last decades in Washington, D.C., there's often been debate about what is the key to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. For many years, people said it was the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, that if you want to stabilize the Middle East, bring peace and prosperity to the Middle East, you had to try to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In 2003, the Bush administration argued that the road to peace in the Middle East didn't go through Jerusalem, but it went through Baghdad. And they believed by replacing Saddam Hussein with what they hoped would be a secular democratic government, that would stabilize the Middle East. And increasingly these days, especially I would argue at the State Department, the biggest hope people have for some type of a regional peace accord or modus vivendi between countries is to try to bring about a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And this is a topic which gets a lot of media attention these days. As you know, there's kind of three parts to the Iran-Saudi rivalry. It's ethnic, Persian, Iran versus Arab, Saudi Arabia. It's sectarian, Shiite, Iran versus Sunni, Saudi Arabia. But I would argue it's above all geopolitical. If you look at the bloodiest conflicts in today's Middle East, whether that's Syria, Yemen, Iraq, to a lesser extent Lebanon, Bahrain, they all have elements of the Iran-Saudi rivalry. And I would argue that just like China and Japan are kind of natural rivals in Asia, Brazil and Argentina are natural rivals in South America, France and Germany are natural rivals in Europe. Iran and Saudi Arabia in many ways are kind of destined to be competitors, but they're not necessarily destined to be adversaries. So despite the fact you often read in the newspaper, and even President Obama used the adjective primordial. He said these are primordial conflicts in the Middle East, implicitly saying that Sunnis and Shiites have been fighting each other for hundreds or 1,000 years, and so it's inevitable that they will continue fighting. I would argue that what's fueling the Iran-Saudi conflict these days is much more geopolitical than it is ethnic or sectarian. On the surface, it appears like it's ethnic or sectarian, but the reality is that when there aren't geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia have had kind of a cold working relationship. And so I think what happens these days is that the regional conflicts exacerbate the mutual mistrust and hostility between Riyadh and Tehran, and then that in turn further exacerbates the regional conflicts. But one of the reasons Saudi Arabia has been so incensed as a result of the nuclear deal is that since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, U.S. foreign policy toward the Persian Gulf was pretty consistent, and it was premised on kind of two pillars, and that was cooperation with Saudi Arabia and the containment of Iran. And for the first time now in 3-4 decades, President Obama has somewhat challenged that paradigm with the nuclear deal with Iran and with his unprecedented attempts to try to engage the Iranian government. And you can understand Riyadh's perspective in that they believe that the basis of their relationship with Washington, and not just Saudi Arabia, but other Gulf countries as well, it's based on two assessments. One is that the United States needs Gulf countries for energy security to ensure the free flow of oil from those Gulf countries. And second was a mutual concerns about Iran, which the United States and Gulf countries share. And we see now with shale energy revolution in the United States, we're far less dependent, the United States is far less dependent on Gulf energy reserves than we were, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So that's undermined one basis for the relationship. And second, in the eyes of many Gulf countries, there's a belief that the United States is actively trying to pursue a rapprochement with Iran. And so if the United States and Iran are no longer adversaries, if they become friends, what will be the basis of the alliance between the U.S. and Gulf countries. Now, I always tell my my friends in the Gulf that I think that they exaggerate the extent to which the United States and Iran are now actively cooperating. There's still tremendous tension and mistrust between the United States and Iran. And I think as long as the government in Saudi Arabia wants to be allied with the United States and the leadership in Iran, namely the supreme leader, embraces this slogan of death to America, there's not going to be major change in this dynamic between Iran, America, and Saudi Arabia. But certainly over the longer term, 10, 15, 20 years, I think you could see a scenario whereby the United States relationship with Saudi Arabia begins to fray a little bit.